All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to check out great gems that you probably have never heard of because they've been suppressed, but if you had, they would help you out with all kinds of things, your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview. We check out magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries. This is our 265th Bible Decode. We've been looking at the pretty much suppressed Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. You'll only see a rare Christian who will even kick the tires on the Roman origins hypothesis, labeling it as a conspiracy theory or outrageous or proven wrong or debunked. However, really of all the kind of crazy conspiracy theories that I've checked out in my life, this one is the most rock solid and has the most explanatory power. The theory is basically that the New Testament of the Bible was written by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, as Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, who ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. They wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews. It was a psyop. It's a piece of wartime propaganda. The Romans had just gotten done defeating the Jews in a war called War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. Both Vespasian and Titus were generals in that war. Both of them were wounded in that war. And they had a vested interest in subduing the Jews. They knew that even though they had just gotten done decimating the Jews, that the Jews would be back fighting because they had been, the Romans had been fighting the Jews nonstop for the last 130 years, ever since the Romans pulled in under Pompey in 63 BC. One insurrection after a riot, after an uprising, after a revolution, after a war. And this 66 to 73 war was really the culmination of all of that. The Jews were a proud people. They were the chosen people by their idiosyncratic and very, what I would call, personality disorder laden God, you know, who was zealous and jealous and insecure and had a major smoking addiction problem and was obsessive compulsive. And so he saddled his people with a great deal of rituals and rites and sacrifices and, you know, things that they needed to do, strictures against graven images, all their kosher food laws, circumcision, Sabbath observation, and these were all things that were a pain in the butt for the Romans to administer or to observe. They had to administer the Jews doing all these things, and the Jews were really, many of them were willing to die to maintain these rituals. Generally, the Romans were very tolerant of religious freedom. Of all the different groups in their empire, the Jews were the most hardest to deal with. But they believed in allowing you to practice your own religion as long as you gave a nod to Caesar. And so when Emperor Caligula attempted to try to put a statue of himself in the Jewish temple, that basically led to almost a full-blown war. And the Romans actually had to relent. They basically gave the Jews an exception. Okay, we're putting a temple in everybody's sanctuary except for yours, because apparently it's you guys are the chosen people or whatever. And so another context that has to be considered is that when Vespasian becomes emperor in 69 AD, this was really the culmination of the Roman Civil War. And when you look at, this was the end of the year of the 4 emperors in Rome. It started in really 68 AD with the assassination of Emperor Nero. And he was replaced by Emperor Galba. And he was promptly assassinated. And he was replaced by Emperor Otho, who was promptly assassinated. And then he was replaced by Emperor Vitellius, who was promptly assassinated. And so now when they give the call to Vespasian, he's kind of got to be like, should I accept this or not? Do I want to be assassinated in the next 2 months? Because that's what's happened to my 4 predecessors. And so you've got to consider that Vespasian was probably going to marshal any type of operation or resources that he could to shore up his authority. And so the Romans also took advantage of the fact that the Jews, coming from all the Old Testament prophecies, were literally waiting for a Messiah to help them overthrow the Romans. So that was another threat. But they turned it around, the Romans, and instead they wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, and turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the very same time going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the Jewish moneylenders and cussing out the Jewish vendors who were selling small animals for the sacrifice, and converting, pursuing his own disciples and encouraging them, or really demanding that they abandon their families to follow him. So Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish traditions, rituals, folklore, while at the same time being totally deferential to the Romans. And then if you move on in the New Testament, you'll discover that Paul is even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew than Jesus was, almost as if it was written by the Romans. And the Roman origin hypothesis says just that. It was written by the Romans. And there is a long line of scholars who have argued this point, starting with way back in the 19th century Bruno Bauer, to 20th century work done by Abelard Reuchlin, Roman Piso, and especially in the 21st century Joseph Atwill's book Caesar's Messiah, as well as authors such as Henry Davis, James Valiant, C.J. Fahey, and Cliff Carrington, and Michael Menescott in his new book called Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. He puts it all together, or much of it together, and I think really just, Atwill provides a great amount of proof, direct from the scriptures, and Menescott does him one better. Now, again, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence for it. The Romans had the motive that we've talked about. They had the method, or the MO. They had created other religions in the first century for psychological operations purposes. they had the means and the opportunity, and they were really the only people who had the means and the opportunity to do this. They had full control of censorship, of distribution, and of publishing within the empire. They also were bilingual in Greek and Latin, and the New Testament is written in Greek. Not so much in Judea, where they spoke, and very few of them were literate, but if they did, they wrote in Aramaic. Very few, only the elite upper crust of the Jews used Greek. But the direct evidence is overwhelming. But in order to kind of unlock the direct evidence from the scriptures, you need one more book, which was written by the Romans by a guy named Flavius Josephus. You probably heard of Josephus as really one of the earliest corroborating evidence of the existence of Jesus, of a secular source who describes Jesus. Now that is no longer valid once you recognize that he's in on the psyop, and all of the other early authors who mention Jesus are also in on the psyop, and that includes Tacitus, Suetonius, Trajan, and Pliny the Younger, all of them being denizens of the Roman royal court, if not emperors themselves. So none of that can be taken seriously as corroborating evidence of the existence of Jesus, even if it could have been in the first place, which it shouldn't have been because it's so long after the so-called events had occurred. But what the Romans really did is they backdated the story by 40 years. They wrote it in the 70s and backdated it into the 30s, late 20s, early 30s, and they wrote this, which was the same time that the Gospels were written. The Gospels weren't written until the 70s and 80s. Mark was supposed to have been written first, and then Matthew, and then Luke, and then John later. Some people disagree, some scholars disagree, but no earlier than the 60s. But generally, most scholars believe that all of the Gospels were written after the Jewish war, at least after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, or Jerusalem in general, in 70 AD. And so anyway, when you read Josephus's 7-volume work, a history called War of the Jews, alongside your Gospels, you will discover, if you're looking with the right lens, that they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. There are so many parallels between the two that they practically are, the book of Luke in particular is saturated with parallels. Michael Menescot's dug into that in his book and found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And that's over 10 per chapter. That's over 1 per 5 verses. And some of the parallels go on for verse after verse after verse. So just about the entire text of the book of Luke is part of a parallel, has parallels in Josephus's War of the Jews. Not only that, but Menescot's graphed the parallels on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, and discovered that when he plotted all 250 plus points, that they made 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars. APTVS, Titus and Vespasian, being the T and the V, and probably the S. Also, another there are many different families of parallels or themes of the parallels. One other theme is that the ministry of Jesus is nothing but a replica of the 3-year military campaign of Titus, Vespasian's son, in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and they each encounter parallel events at each location that are separated in time by 40 years, sometimes to the hour. And we're talking about over 40 such events. So the the events of the New Testament are exactly the same as the events of War of the Jews, or at least they are exactly analogous. And the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled literally in the pages of War of the Jews, mostly by General Titus, including the one about the destruction of Jerusalem, which Jesus says himself is a marker or a sign of his second coming, which makes Titus the second coming of Jesus, because he is the one responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. And scholars throughout the ages have known this. They have known that Titus is the second coming of Jesus, but this was kind of like wiped off the board in the 20th century. And so nobody talks about this anymore, but it used to be the majority view among theologians that Titus was the second coming of Jesus. But now we're looking in the future, and that Armageddon is going to occur, is still yet to occur, when according to the scriptures, it clearly occurred in the first century. That's if you take any of this seriously, which you won't after you hear all of the evidence. Anyway, we are looking at an adjacent author named Robert Eisenman, who unfortunately was not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis at the time of most of his writing, but he was a scholar who was key in unlocking the translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also, which is really our only valid source from the first century. Now that if the Gospels are a psychological operation and Josephus is a psychological operation, scholars of the first century have very, very little to work with. More, they have some things to work with, but those are the two major sources. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls enter the picture in the 40s and the 50s, but they weren't really translated and given to the scholars until the early 90s, thanks to the work of Robert Eisenman. But he's also a scholar of many of the other key texts from this period, especially the Pseudo-Clementine homilies and recognitions. And this is an excerpt from his book that is called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, which is a compendium of a number of his different works, a couple of his books, shorter books, and many articles. This is an article that's called Paul as Herodian. Eisenman was able to figure out that there is a red flag with Paul. What is this guy who claims that he's a Pharisee? What is he doing hobnobbing with Romans all over the place and, denigrating Jews all over the place and encouraging his people to go away from all of the Jewish traditions, the circumcision, the kosher food laws, the Sabbath, and so on? What is going on with this guy, Paul? And he concludes by, through the evidence that he was able to look at and take seriously, much of which was either Josephus or the book of Acts or some of the epistles, that Paul was a member of the Herod family. The Herods being, descended from Herod the Great, and they were all like kind of puppet governors of Judea in the first centuries BC and AD. And so we'll start here kind of toward the end of this article. it will probably never be possible to sort out the facts concerning this tangle of events in our triangle of sources, and what transpositions occurred, if any. However, in order to contend that Saulus and Paul are identical, Saulus, I believe, is coming from Josephus, and Paul are identical, one would have to assume that Paul, after his appeal to Nero, did return to Jerusalem. This is not as implausible as it may appear at first impression because, as we saw, our sources fall uncharacteristically silent on the subject of Paul's last years and, for instance, the matter of his proposed trip to Spain alluded to in Romans 15:28, not to mention the fates of all important leaders such as Peter, James, and Paul. Where Saulus is concerned, aside from his defection to the Romans and last trip to debrief Nero in 66 AD, we know nothing about his ultimate fate either, only that both he and the other Saulus disappeared from the scene at approximately the same time, and both seem to have entered relations with Nero or those on his staff. Regarding these last and Paul, not only does it emerge from a careful consideration of his various contacts, but it is actually boldly stated at the end of one letter, Philippians. Here, Paul speaks about a colleague of his, Epaphroditus. And this is a very important character, Epaphroditus, in terms virtually duplicating those of the Qumran community rule, which is, Qumran is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and community rule is one of the scrolls that they discovered there. And most of the scrolls of the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of the Old Testament. You know, there are like 20 copies of Genesis and 25 copies of Isaiah or whatever. But there are a lot of sectarian texts too, texts that are not part of the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures, but are mainly related to this one sect of very pious Jews that lived there at this monastery at Qumran. And so this one is called the community rule. And in this text it says, being an odor of a sweet smell and an acceptable sacrifice well-pleasing to God. And that is in community rule and also in Philippians 4:18. And this is what he's speaking about Epaphroditus here. Epaphroditus I believe was a slave, but he was a kind of like Nero's secretary. But eventually, I believe he was in on the assassination of Nero. But he still remained. He remained in the Roman court for the next 30 years, and was eventually executed by Emperor Domitian in 95 AD. So this guy was really like a deep state player. He was behind the scenes, engaging in all kinds of nefarious stuff, I believe, and also kind of lends some credence to the fact that Nero probably got the short end of the stick from history, that he might not have been as bad of a guy as he's portrayed as, and same with Domitian, Titus's younger brother Domitian, who I think gets probably a bad rap as well. But he put an end to Epaphroditus. But the main point here is that Epaphroditus is a close buddy of Paul's, enough that he speaks about him and calls him being an odor of a sweet smell and an acceptable sacrifice well-pleasing to God, and especially those of the household of Caesar. He says, after which he sends greetings from all the holy ones, and especially those of the household of Caesar. So Paul is, hobnobbing with these Caesars. That makes no sense from a normal, Pharisaic Jew perspective. by which he seems to mean he is sending greetings from Epaphroditus and others in Nero's own household, to say nothing of calling such persons saints. But this Epaphroditus, who according to Philippians is Paul's comrade in arms, quote, and one of his closest associates, is hardly to be distinguished from Nero's secretary and Josephus's publisher by that name. And Josephus also gives an acknowledgement to Epaphroditus in his War of the Jews. A man who was involved in Nero's last moments and who himself was ultimately executed by Domitian in 95 AD because of it, despite the fact that he had acted as Domitian's secretary as well. This was also around the time of Josephus's own disappearance from the scene. It is hard to imagine that there were several such persons called Epaphroditus. And there's also a portrait sculpture of him that exists, moving in the same circles at the same time, though some might argue this. At an earlier point in Philippians, Paul refers to this Epaphroditus as, quote, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, but your apostle and minister of my need. We feel that this is the Epaphroditus in question, and Josephus does refer to his rich experience of events. In any case, the presumption is very strong. If true, then Paul's contacts, like those of his younger contemporary Josephus thereafter, went very high up in Nero's household indeed. It is certainly possible to conceive that after Paul's first appeal to Nero, he did enter his service in some manner or other, just as his close associate Epaphroditus did. This borne out by the allusion to contacts high up in Nero's household in connection with reference to Epaphroditus in Philippians 4:22 above, if he had not been in this service all along. This, too, is what is implied by the existence of the apocryphal correspondence between Paul and Seneca, Nero's chief minister, whether fictional or based on something more real, and the more than cordial relations Paul obviously enjoyed with Seneca's brother Gallio, also in Corinth, in Acts 18:12-17. Of course, all of this is circumstantial and may or may not prove anything, but it certainly adds to the presumption. Now, Seneca the Younger, according to Roman Piso and Abelard Reuchlin, he was one of the early drafters of the Book of Mark. Okay, he was in on the psychological operation. He proposed the whole operation to Nero, and Nero rejected. Now, Seneca was Nero's tutor when Nero was growing up. And Seneca proposed the Book of Mark and the whole psychological operation to mellow out the Jews to Nero. And Nero was kind of, had a soft spot for the Jews. I believe he was married to, one of his wives was a Jew. I can't remember her name. But Nero wouldn't go for it. And so Seneca and Lucius Piso and a few others, possibly Pliny the Elder, attempted to assassinate Nero. And they got found out, and Nero executed Seneca in 65 AD. And so this is also part of the intrigue here. Now, I wasn't aware that the character named Gallio in the book of Acts is Seneca's brother. So these are even more name dropping by Paul. Paul's name dropping is just in the book of Acts and in the epistles are a long list of Herods and even a list of Flavians and other Caesars involved. So you have to, that's got to be a red flag. How does Paul, who describes himself as a slave, Poppaea is Nero's wife's name, but what is this person who basically is the creator of Christianity doing hobnobbing with all these Caesars and Herods? Okay, it should be remarked that Josephus, whom, as we saw, ultimately became very close to someone called Epaphroditus as well, also entered Roman service in some manner or other after an early trip to Rome and interview with Nero's wife Poppaea around 64 AD, which he documents quite straightforwardly in his autobiography called Vita, and which led directly to his ultimate betrayal of his people. Now, Josephus was supposed to have been a Jew, according to Vita. He was a Jew, and he was a military commander who surrendered to Vespasian, and then saw the light in that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews, and so he defected to the Romans, predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor. When Vespasian did become emperor, he stopped and he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, made him one of the court historians, set him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. So he's now known as Flavius Josephus. And that's where he was set up to write the Jewish War, or War of the Jews, which is the book that corresponds with the Gospels and makes it clear that Josephus, whoever he was also the author of the New Testament, or at least the Gospels. This too seems to have occurred in the aftermath of the Temple Wall affair and James's stoning. However, it is certainly possible to conceive, and this is the author's view, this, in the author's view, is the more likely and the gist of the notices in Josephus, that after a decent amount of time, Paul returned to Palestine to involve himself in its affairs in the manner sketched out with regard to Saulus above, as he had in younger days a couple of decades before. As for Epaphroditus, he certainly had relations with persons at the highest levels of Nero's household, and was very likely a member of it himself. The historical Epaphroditus even seems to have helped Nero commit suicide, or been accused by some, like Domitian, of having assassinated him. Where the man Josephus is calling Saulus is concerned, he too, in some manner, certainly seems to have entered Nero's service. Where Paul is concerned, one can only cite his cordial relations with Roman governors and Herodians generally, plus the notices at the end of Romans and Philippians. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Like, share, subscribe, comment as you see fit. Please come back tomorrow as we return to ancient Rome, ancient Judea, figure out what's going on with Paul, and